So today I'm going to cover what's called the Botvinnik variation of the Semi-Slav. All right, and the first thing to talk about is how you even get to this opening, because there's different move orders, and we'll see several games where Black doesn't play the pure Slav move order actually. Personally, I would suggest if you want to play the Semi-Slav that you just play d5 and c6, and develop it from there. Part of the problem if you try different move orders, it gives white more options, which I'll briefly mention here. So the first game we're going to look at, by the way, was Botvinnik's first kind of high-level crush in this opening, and kind of everyone started paying attention to this opening after he crushed Denker. By the way, this was a radio match between the USSR and the United States where Botvinnik did this. And you'll see Botvinnik plays this e6 move order. And part of the reason I don't suggest it is the following. So knight c3 is one reason. I'll look at another line later too. Now c6. And in this game, Denker played knight f3. But part of the problem with playing this move order of e6 and c6 first is that you give white this extra move e4. Just for the record, playing e6 and c6 like that is called the note boom variation. All right. And allowing white to play e4 leads to a very complicated position. Actually, the main line leads to a gambit after taking and bishop b4. And then for white to really justify playing this, he has to play bishop d2. And the position gets really complicated for both sides, really, here after takes and check. It is very messy, but I don't really recommend it for black. I mean, not only because white has the two bishops, but white has like a lasting kind of positional advantage. Just to show you how one example of how play might go is, say, bishop e2, knight a6, and then, for example, this interesting looking move, bishop f8. The point being that if take with the king, then queen d8 is checkmate, right? This is just one example of the kind of really messy positions you can get into. Okay. So I mean, this is playable for black, by the way, but I don't recommend it. I mean, I think you're going to make your life more difficult. As we'll see, the Botvinnik variation has enough stuff that you need to know already. So having to memorize these lines too is just going to complicate your life. So I don't recommend that. And by the way, the other kind of problem with this move order is that after knight f3, you play knight f6, hoping for knight c3, c6, right? Going to a semi-Slav. But white can throw you off and play g3, which leads to a Catalan. This is fine for black too, but it's a whole other system, really. And it is some personal preference. Personally, as black, I would rather play the black side of an exchange Slav instead of the black side of this Catalan. But it is some preference. And by the way, the exchange Slav, which is really the only reason to not play c6, the move order of that, is after c takes. Okay. So some players playing black might think, oh, it's just symmetrical, I'm not really going to have any winning chances. But as black, that really hasn't been my experience. You still have all your pieces on the board, and now you pretty much have equality, just down to tempo. And I've had no problems with black. Getting a complicated position here. So anyway, that long introduction, basically I just recommend playing d5 and c6, and then knight f6 and e6, okay, if you want to play semi-Slav. Just personal taste there. Just know what you're getting into, though, if you don't want to play that move order. All right, so anyway, Botvinnik chose the e6 move order. And now this starting position is called the Semi-Slav, and today we're only going to look at bishop g5, which is essentially the critical variation for the Semi-Slav. I mean, if you're black playing the Semi-Slav, bishop g5 is going to take up the bulk of your preparation. Alternatively, white can play e3, when generally speaking, play is more calm. Not always. In fact, Anand played the game of the year back in 2013 as black and crushing Aronian. I'm sure some of you might be familiar with that game. But in any case, bishop g5 is the crucial move. And it's the most logical because getting the bishop out before playing e3 makes sure it's active, right? So this is the most tested move. And from here, by the way, black pretty much has three good moves. The Botvinnik system is one of them. Oh, do you have a question? No. Okay. Yeah. So the Botvinnik system, which we're going to look at today, is one of them, but there are two others. Knight BD7 is playable too. This is called the Cambridge Springs, and H6, which is the Moscow. Um, Objectively speaking, I'd say the Moscow is probably the best for black here. Just personal opinion there. Um, but it's not going to be as complicated as the Botvinnik. You know, if you want to play for a win as black or achieve a really complicated position, which you can definitely do playing the Botvinnik, then you're going to want to play that variation. Okay. Okay. So D takes C4. This move looks really natural in a way, but it invites a lot of complications, as it turns out. So E4. So now white is intending just to play bishop takes C4 and have this massive pawn center, right? So if black is to justify his opening, pretty much has to play B5. But the reason this invites complications is white can now play E5, right? Now, can someone tell me how black can avoid even losing a piece here? Obviously, if you've seen this opening before, you probably know, but if you haven't, it might not be so obvious.
It's not H6. No.
Yeah, H6 is forced. You have to attack the pinning piece because you can't move the knight, and if you just move your queen or something, he takes the piece. So H6 is the only move, and now white just retreats the bishop. So again, we only have one choice, which is what?
G5.
Yeah, G5. So it looks like it kind of saves us, but there's a few lines white can play here, but knight takes G5 is definitely the best. Takes. So white's giving him a piece, but now the pin is still there. So white's definitely going to get that piece back. So we play knight D7. This ensures that when white takes an F6, he can't play bishop takes and fork the queen and the rook, right? So you need to protect that knight somehow. And just for the record, white taking an F6 right away, it is slightly inaccurate, but it's all right. Now bishop B7. And this was the first time I think Denker had faced this, so he plays bishop E2. It turns out this isn't very accurate. The best move here is actually to play G3, right? And we'll see that later. It's important for white to contest that light squared bishop on the long diagonal. But bishop E2, now queen B6, and black castles. Yeah, one thing to note in this line is black pretty much always castles on the queen side here. So white's trying to break up the queen side, but it kind of backfires here. Because now black is able to unleash that light squared bishop. This threatens mate on H2. And now black can't take the bishop right away because of rook C1, but that wasn't what Botvinnik had in mind. So first he threatens mate on G2. F3 is the only way to stop it. And now D3. Point of D3 is to open up that A7 G1 diagonal for that dark squared bishop. And now, does anyone see what black is threatening with this move? He's not just guarding the pawn.
Queen takes G3.
Yeah, queen takes G3 threaten. So queen F4. And surprisingly, white is already lost here. How does black win?
I want to play like C2.
Oh, rook takes H2.
Yeah, rook takes H2, king takes H2.
Rook H8.
So you've given up a rook, but white can actually give up a piece temporarily, it looks like. Say knight H5, and after knight H5, what?
Rook takes H5.
Rook H5, king G3. So white's king is out, but you're down the exchange.
D3 takes F5.
Oh, rook takes G5.
Yeah, I'm sorry, what did you say? Oh, okay.
Rook to g5.
Yeah, because the pin. Now, what we're looking at, by the way, so that's what Botvinnik played, of course, after king takes, and now rook h8. Now, Denker did not play knight h5, but if he had, what we were looking at is rook h5, and then rook g5. And white loses the queen as well, right, because of that pin. So even though I think most of you would pretty much always see that move at the board, you should still calculate it before you sacrifice a rook, right? I mean, that is a lot of material to sacrifice, okay? All right, but anyway, he played queen h4, which, may look relatively better, but doesn't work out well either. Rook takes, and now how does black finish off? Keep in mind that white did win 2 rooks for the queen, right?
Oh, queen f4.
This is a problem for white. It's actually a fork, right? You're attacking the bishop on h4 and that bishop on c4. Right? Both of those, one of those is going to fall. Oh, actually, I think I just realized. I don't think I started the recording.
I did.
Oh, you did? Okay. All right. All right, and yeah, Denker just resigned after that. So this was a pretty spectacular, first outing for this opening. And after this, the world kind of took notice. And over the next, 30, 40 years, people were analyzing this a lot. It wasn't until computers became strong enough that people started to play the opening more precisely, and we'll get into that. Okay. So, by the way, does everyone know who Mikhail Botvinnik is? So he was a former Soviet world champion. So I talk about playing at the world stage and people taking notice. When one of the world's top players plays at opening, it tends to become kind of fashionable after that. So just letting you know why that happened. All right, and Bronstein later played Botvinnik in this line too, but he played a slightly different line, trying to avoid Botvinnik's preparation. By the way, one of the things about the Botvinnik variation is that the lines go pretty deep, so there's a lot of preparation, there's a lot of knowledge, and even kind of memorization that you kind of have to do to play it well. So, at the time, people were pretty scared of this, so that's why a lot of people didn't even allow him to play this. So this time we see Botvinnik playing the move order that I'm recommending, i.e. c6, knight f6, and then e6. Okay. So it all looks the same, except this time Bronstein took an f6. And this line is trickier than it might look at first sight. So now it takes. So this time black doesn't have a material deficit, and he has the 2 bishops. But white has some tricks. So now knight e5. Now you may want to play a move like knight d7 to eliminate that knight, but this would be a blunder.
Knight takes c6.
Now knight takes c6, black would be happy. He could play, I don't know, queen b6.
Okay. Knight takes f.
What's that?
Knight takes f. You bring your
Is
light
that just
square
queen
to
h5?
Well, queen h5, black can play queen f6.
Is that like knight e4?
No, knight e4, black can play probably bishop b4 check.
Knight takes f6.
Knight takes f6.
Yeah.
It's white's move. It's not possible. This is
No,
f6.
F7.
Okay, so knight f7, king takes.
Then you bring your queen and light square bishop.
And the light squared bishop.
Yeah, so no, you bring the queen, so queen h5.
Okay, queen h5, say king takes f6. King g8 loses to queen g6, right?
Knight e4.
Yeah.
No, knight e4 doesn't work. Black can play king e7, and it'll be okay. Yeah. So knight f7, queen h5,
Oh, me too.
and skewer. so black loses the queen. So this is a trick you should watch out for. So instead, black has to get rid of this pawn at f6 right away. Not really ideal, but it's okay. And now g3. This move may look unnatural, hoping to maybe, or it looks like it's, undoubling black's doubled h pawns. But the point is, white wants to get a bishop to the long diagonal. And as you can see, that's kind of problematic. But black has a good move here, knight d7. Now, knight takes c6 isn't really a problem here. Black could just play bishop b7, followed by maybe a6, and he'll be happy. So white plays queen e2, trying to maintain a stronghold on e5. Now takes. And so Botvinnik played queen e7, which is fine. Although nowadays they think that queen g5 is probably slightly better, trying to keep white from castling queenside. And if white plays f4, then that weakens g3. Black can play like queen g7 or something like that. But he played queen e7, which is fine, by the way. It just looks more passive, as you'll see. And it looks passive because now white gets that rook on d6, and it looks like white has quite a grip on the position, but it's not as great as you might think. Yeah, queen g4 was a miscalculation by Bronstein. He was relying on black taking on e4, and then after bishop takes e4, queen h7 becomes very dangerous for white. But he missed this c5 move from Botvinnik. And unfortunately now, if the knight moves, the bishop on g2 falls. And from here, the rest of the game is still kind of complicated, but we're not going to go over the rest. At this point, black flipped a piece, and although it's just a matter of technique, it is complicated technique, but nonetheless, black is winning at this point. But the important thing was to remember that opening trick. So by the way, if you're white and you want to avoid the labyrinth of theory in the Botvinnik, this is an option. And if your opponent is not familiar with the knight takes f7 trick, he can easily lose, right? And it is playable for white, although black is probably slightly better. But just remember, as black, you got to take that pawn at f6, and then don't be afraid about giving up your c6 pawn. Don't be a stickler here. Okay. All right. And then there's one more tricky sideline that I just want to briefly show here. So by the way, this game would feature the Moscow move order, but it's essentially a transposition. This would essentially be the Botvinnik where white played bishop g3. So just to show you what I mean, if black had taken c4, we'd get to the same position. So we have this transposition. It's essentially where white doesn't take an f6 or on g5 and just retreats the bishop. It may not really make sense to retreat the bishop because the bishop on g3 isn't very useful, right? But white's idea is that black has weakened the king side, and white hopes to kind of exploit these holes that black has in his position from playing g5 and b5. But it's not really that great. And let's just go back to the game here. So knight goes to d5, of course. You want to centralize. And when you play this Botvinnik line, or pretty much any line in the Semi-Slav, b7 is pretty much always placed for that bishop. And now queen b6 is an important move. You want to put pressure on d4, so you force white to kind of show his hand early. So knight e4. And a5 is an next important move here. What you don't want to allow in these positions is for white to play a5, and it can really cramp your position. So a6 may look more natural, kind of fortifying your queenside pawn structure, but then white can play a move like a5, and then queen c7, and now, for example, knight c5.
Yeah.
And your bishop on b7 is just so awful. It's in a cage. So please avoid this kind of position. All right. All right. So a5 is important. And although white won back a couple pawns, and it's kind of near material equality, it's not really good enough for white. White couldn't actually take that pawn. Black played queen d5, which is good enough, but more crushing would have been queen c6 actually. The point being that white can exploit a pin after f3 is forced, protect g2, and now rook d5. And white has no way to save that knight. Queen d5 turned out to be good enough too, and black eventually won with that passed d pawn. But the rest of this game isn't too significant. Okay, so just remember against this bishop g3 line, you want to install the knight on d5, bishop on b7, queen goes to b6, and remember to play a5 and don't let white get that in. All right. So now let's get to one of the big main lines here. So d takes c, b5. So we're back to the main line again. And here's the first time where we see g3. So c5, d5. White has to block the long diagonal. And queen b6. Now, for the record, it's worth knowing why b4 is no good. b4 looks natural because if white moves a knight, you just take on d5, right? But b4 is not a good idea. So white to play. What does white do here?
It weakens the c4 pawn.
Well, yeah, but if white moves a knight, black takes on d5, and black's eliminated white's center, attacking the rook on h1. It would be good for black. White only has one good move, but it is winning.
Is it 95?
No, knight b5, bishop takes pawn.
94 with eyes on the d6 square?
No, knight e4, bishop takes pawn, and then the knight's being attacked, and d6 is guarded by the bishop.
So it's too soon to
D
take
takes
c4.
e6.
D takes e6 is tempting, but after knight e5, black is winning, surprisingly. There's all kinds of threats with knight f3, attacking the rook. Yeah,
A4?
What piece?
a4. You mean pawn a4?
Yeah.
No, if a4, black takes the knight. Yeah.
So bishop c5. c5.
You mean bishop c4?
Yeah.
Yeah, you're correct. Yeah. And black is in serious trouble because if he takes on c3, then after taking on e6, it's hard to see how he can defend because if you take on e6, then f7 wins the queen. And if you play knight e5, how does white win here? Yeah.
Pawn F2? No, pawn F7.
Yeah, takes f7, knight f7, and now
Bishop.
Bishop takes f7.
bishop f7, king f7, and black's winning.
Okay.
I think it's mate in 3.
Queen
Bishop
H5.
e5.
Yeah, bishop e5.
Bishop b5, yeah. And black has no way to block the check, right? You have to take, and then checkmate, right?
Yeah.
All right, so just a quick lesson there for black. If you're playing this, don't play b4, and if you're white, know that bishop c4 refutes it. All right. So queen b6 is the right move. Queen b6 prepares both queenside castling and defends the b5 pawn, right? That's important. Now bishop g2, white guards the d5 square, and now black castle. And only now can we play b4, right? Since white's not attacking c4, and white no longer has this threat to the king with d takes e6. And now there's two main moves. One is rook b1 and one is knight a4. But first we're going to look at rook b1. This move may look kind of surprising. You know, black threatens your knight and you just move your rook. But the point is tactics. So if black takes on c3, the b file becomes open and it's devastating. So after say queen a6, white can play rook takes b7, queen takes on e6, and the black king is just way too weak, and these pawns are going to be very tricky. You know, for example, queen c7. I think e7 is winning. That pawn on the 7th is going to be too much here, and black's king is still weak. You know, queen a4 is coming. So the knight is untouchable. But black can play queen a6 first, and now we're threatening to take on c3, because now if white were to take back, we could block the b file with knight b6, something like that. So now white's forced to act. So take on e6, bishop g2, and e7. Okay. If white just played king takes g2, black would play f takes or queen takes e6. It would be pretty good. So e7, bishop f1, queen d5. We're going to see another possibility in the future too with white playing king f1, but queen d5 is the main move. E takes d8 may look like the most natural, but after king takes d8, black is actually winning here. The problem is black's up a piece right now, and he's still attacking knight on c3. So even if white takes back in f1, take on c3, white's going to be down a piece. So queen d5. Now there's an important theme here for black, and we're going to see it in the other variation too. It's important for black to take on e7 there. You want to connect those rooks. Now the knight was being threatened, so it had to move. White's relying on some tactics to rely on not losing that rook. And you have perpetual check. Unfortunately, white can't play for a win. If you avoid the perpetual checks, you know, black's going to have that extra rook, right? All right. So now let's look at a second possibility. So queen d5 is essentially draw, which for black might feel like a letdown. But keep in mind, you know, white pretty much had to find all those right moves. And if white's going to study this line, I can't imagine he would know all this just to get a draw, right? So now we're looking at a different try for advantage. So this is the more accurate way of playing for white, delaying taking on f6 and just developing. But it does lead to the same position. Castle, castle. So rook b1, queen a6. And this time, instead of queen d5, we see white taking on f1 with the king. All right. So again, black wants to take on e7. White had both the bishop and the knight under attack, so this is the only move to guard them both. And now black pretty much has to sack back, because otherwise white's going to play knight d6, queen d5, or queen e8. Attacking the knight and the rook, by the way. And the position's kind of messy here, but it's essentially equal. By the way, I chose to look at this game because white in this game was... oh, I'm sorry, I guess that's the next one. All right, by the way, this is a recent game, just played earlier this year in April. So this is just an example of what can happen in this line. And again, we just have a draw. White has to accept it because moving the knight would be disaster. You know, for example, knight d2, how does black win here? Yeah, queen h3. If king g1, rook e1, and queen g2, rook e1, and just wins all the same, right? So yeah, white had to accept the draw essentially again. Now we're looking at one more game in this line, and this is I took notice of this game because white was Conrad Holt, and if you don't know anything about this guy, he essentially the way he got to be grandmaster and the way he still trains is he goes on ICC Internet Chess Club and he plays game after game after game, exact same opening, just meticulously improving here and there. So when I see him enter into a theoretical line, I usually take notice. But he couldn't find an advantage either for white. So this time he plays queen d5, right? Instead of the previous game we saw white play queen e2. So queen e2 was to attack c4 and guard the pawn, but queen d5 looks more aggressive. But again, I think I'd say black is pretty much still equal here. And we end up in this kind of interesting endgame. So black has his queenside majority versus white's kingside majority. Now I think both sides really could play for winning as a weaker player, but really I think it's pretty equal. And it does get kind of messy, but it never really veers from equality here. The last move may look like a sacrifice, but of course can't take the knight because of the queening square. And then they decide to draw here because black plays knight c4, takes the pawn, and worst case scenario, black can always sacrifice the knight for white's last pawn. So there's no way either side can win. All right. So that's why rook b1 has been an idea, but it's probably not going to lead to much advantage for white. Knight e4 is much trickier, and I think it's really the critical line in this variation. All right, so let's look at that. So again, this should all look familiar. And this time, knight a4. Okay. So queen b5 is one option, although, and this is the recommendation of Lars Schandorf. By the way, a great book if you want to play the Semi-Slav is Lance Schandorf. I think is his name. Lars Schandorf, sorry, not Lance. He wrote a book for Grandmaster Repertoire for quality chess online. It's really pretty awesome. He recommends queen b5, but I'm not as sure as he is that this is really that safe. So let's look at it. So it takes. Again, we take on g2. And this queen c6 takes e6 maneuver is kind of important. By the way, this line is a little bit different than the other ones. If e7, black can just take an f1, right, as we saw before. Except this time, it's more dangerous for white because this knight a4 is offsides. In other positions, it was on c3, and it can join the center via e4. But because the knight's on a4, this variation is much worse. For example, after takes, and rook g8, black is pretty much winning here. That knight on a4 is just too passive here. We can't even play something like h4 because of rook g5, right? And if you can't move the queen and try to invade either because white can just take your knight. Right. Okay, so that's why white has to take back. But this time we can play queen c6 and wrap up the pawn. So by the way, at this point, black is doing pretty well. Notice how all these pieces are in the center. Yeah, centralization, keeping your pieces centralized is an important idea in chess. and white resign now. There's no way to stop black from winning, g5 and f6, and with the f pawn he'll be able to win even if he trades rooks, right? Now, if black had an h pawn, black's pawn right and h7 here, it would probably be a draw, because then if you ever traded rooks, there'd be no way for you to promote, right? And if you don't trade rooks, you'll have bishop and rook versus rook, which is a draw. I mean, it is hard to defend bishop and rook versus rook, but theoretically it is a draw. Right. Okay. So now let's look at another queen b5 game, but this one is more unpleasant. Is this the game I'm thinking of? Yeah. So this was the very highest level between two of the top Chinese players, Ding Liren and Yu Yangyi. Both these guys are over 2750. So let's see what happened. So this time we see this a3 move. This works out better than d takes e6. As we saw the previous game, the problem with d takes e6 is after bishop g2, black achieved nice centralization with the queen c6 check and then takes e6 maneuver. So a3 is much more dangerous. Now knight b8. Now knight b8 is kind of cute. The idea is black just wants to win the pawn on d5. It turns out it's actually not that easy. So queen g4 is important, not allowing black to play e takes d5. Because if black could play e takes d5, he'd have one large connected pawn mass, right? So this ensures that black will have a weakness on c4. Now it looks like white may have blundered, but let's hide the notation. So white to play, what does white do here? It's very messy. Yeah?
Queen takes e6.
Oh, the pawn at f7 guards it.
Didn't see the
Rook takes c6.
Rook c6 is tempting, but it loses.
It is tempting.
So why does rook take c6 not work?
Queen takes
Now queen c6, queen g5 is white's idea.
King b7.
Yeah, king b7 is a problem. So now our queen's still under attack, and if we can't move the queen anywhere where it keeps an eye on g5 and defends c6, if we play queen e4, black can just take, and if you keep an eye on the rook, then black can play king takes, right? So unfortunately, it doesn't work out. So first, queen d4. Yeah, it turns out that black can't exactly defend everything very well because king b7 now loses the queen d7, and we can't keep an eye on that knight. So king b8, but now rook c6, and white's relying on a cute tactic with the check on f4. That's why rook g3. So if we just take on c6, then white can play queen f4 and take that rook. So black tries to get a pawn in the process. And by the way, it's annoying for white because if you play h takes g3, then black has this dangerous attack on the h file. And if you play f takes, then you open up the a7 g1 diagonal, right? So it's kind of annoying for white too. In this position, it's kind of interesting. And Shandorf kind of talks about it. It's like a mutual zugzwang in a way. It's hard for black to develop his pieces, and it's hard for white to improve his pieces too. So rook d1. Now, of course, white can't take on a4 because of queen d8 and rook d7, and white's attack is too strong. So queen c7, stopping queen d8, and now b3. It's hard for both sides to improve their position here, but I think it's simply easier for white to play because his king is a little bit safer. So king c8, this is essentially a waiting move. It's hard for black to do anything. You can't move your bishop out anywhere, right? You can't play bishop d6 because it's guarded by the queen there. You can't play bishop h6 because then white could play knight c5. So it's kind of an interesting position. Now, by the way, it's not all beautiful for white either. If you try to improve your queen's placement with like queen e4, Sorry, going back. Then you allow black to play bishop c5 and get that bishop out. So it's kind of an interesting dynamic, but we'll see how white untangles here. So you repeat a couple moves, but now queen d3. And white lets the bishop out, but he's okay here with playing this kind of really kind of complicated endgame. And what white's relying on here is the weakness of black's king. Now, objectively, it's pretty equal, but I think it's much more dangerous for black. And at this point, unfortunately, it's a tough endgame for black because white's king is just so active here. And now black resigned that nice final move. If you take, then rook a7 skewers. Right. So none of this was forced, by the way. I just wanted to show this game because, you know, and black is probably doing okay. You know, black didn't defend perfectly, according to, you know, some analysis. But I do think it is easier for white to play. If we go back to this critical middle game position here. So white played this queen d3 move and let it out. But I think this position after queen f4 is just, you know, pretty much easier for white. Although, you know, black can probably draw or defend, you know, with accurate play. So ultimately, I suppose it's up to you guys. But personally, I would prefer the queen a6 line, which I'm going to show you. Okay. So black doesn't have to accept going into that position. So let's look at the alternative. So again, the same line. This time queen a6. And we'll see the difference here in a minute. So a3. Now we can just play bishop takes right away. And the point here is that we can play knight e5. By the way, this game we're not going to really see the critical line, but we'll see, you know, one example line. So by the way, in this line, black's giving up the exchange, but black gets a lot of compensation. And for the record, queen d6 is an important tactical point. You don't want to play queen c6 because that would allow white to play bishop f4, and white wouldn't be forced to take the exchange then. So queen d6 is kind of important. Since now bishop f4 would just look silly, you just take the piece. So a7 can't be taken, of course, because of knight f3. So black gives up an exchange here, but in return, he has this beast of a knight, and he still has this healthy pawn majority on the queen side. And it is really unclear, but I think black is pretty much holding his own here. And again, you know, if you're playing a weaker player, I think you could probably outplay from black's perspective. So each side has this pawn race going on. You know, I don't know if I explicitly mentioned it yet, but if you don't like complicated positions, then this is not exactly the opening for you. So it looks hopeless for white, but rook g8. Now rook b5 wouldn't work because of c3. Followed by moving the knight, c2. So now both sides get their new queens. And then the game finally ends in perpetual check. Right? So very, very messy. So again, none of that was forced. You know, black could have played differently. Maybe he could have tried to restrain white's kingside pawns more. White could have played differently as well. But I think black is doing pretty well there. And this queen a6 line has been the kind of the new theory. By the way, pretty much the only high-level player to consistently play the Botvinnik within the last decade or so has been Shirov. If you know anything about Shirov, he just loves complicated openings. Um, but you know, in this game in particular, or sorry, earlier we saw Yu Yang Yi playing it as black, right? He doesn't usually play it, but the fact that some high-level players are still playing it is, you know, shows that it's still pretty decent. All right, now let's look at one more. And this, in my opinion, is pretty much the critical variation here for black. So this time knight takes c5. White is relying on a discovery from that rook on a1. So white first just attacks knight on d5. Now a takes b. And we have this really messy position. And this time black's not down the exchange, but white has a nice bishop, and you know black's king is again really loose here. So rook c1 giving up the exchange. White didn't have to do that. White could have played something like rook a2 if he wanted to. But white does get a lot of compensation for the exchange. For one, he gets rid of black's a pawn. So it's essentially a pretty equal endgame. You know, white has these two extra pawns, which are kind of scary, but black can deal with it. And we essentially get a positional draw. White can't move the bishop because of e4, and so black just repeats. So yeah, I think this line, I just kind of briefly went over it. I think white could have definitely improved in this line, either by keeping the rook by not playing rook c1, or after that, you know, white had some better moves here too. But I think if you're playing a weaker player as black, that you can outplay them here because you do have the extra exchange, and if you get enough activity with those rooks, you can kind of overwhelm white. So anyway, you know, this opening is really messy. If you're going to play the Botvinnik, if you know everything I've presented here, pretty much, you are going to crush a lot of people, because most of your opponents are hardly going to know the first few moves of their opening, much less 20 moves into it. So that's one nice thing about the Botvinnik is that you can beat people with your homework basically, all right? If they try to play into the main lines. Now, of course, in the opening they don't have to play bishop g5, but once they do and you take on c4. There's not really too many options for them to avoid a complicated game, right?
Yeah,
Oh, yeah?
can you practice Botvinnik if you're black? Because not
Mhm.
every player can play bishop g5, for example.
Yeah, no. I mean, pretty much most openings, it's not going to be forced. Are you talking about like where white plays e3 or?
Yeah, if you're playing the Semi-Slav as black,
Mhm.
it's not often that your opponent is going to play bishop g4, bishop g5. It's
Okay.
well, most of the players play just e3, and so you can't really practice Botvinnik because not so much player plays it.
Okay, so you want to practice it without, because your opponents are avoiding it.
Yeah,
So
okay.
really, if you want to practice the Botvinnik, I'd suggest playing against the computer. Really,
Oh.
that'd be good practice, and especially actually, I'd recommend playing as white against it. Just to get a feel for things you might not understand. As white, you may think, oh, why can't I do this? And of course, the computer will show you why, right? So that'll give you some ammo as black. And play it as black too. If you're losing on move 20 or something in this line as black, that means you're not playing the theory correctly, right? So just some tips there. And if you play online in Blitz, especially, not everyone may play it, but you'll get enough experience. There will be enough people who play bishop g5.
Can Can black ever exploit the semi-open H file, whereas white's kingside pawn structure just too solid?
If black plays incorrectly, definitely. Let me see if I can think of an example where white blunders. Let's see, what's a good example? I think I have to go back to rook b1. This line. Let's see. Yeah, if white plays correctly, it's hard to exploit.
Right.
But let's see. That's a good example. Yeah, I can't think of the blunder at the moment.
No, I can't either.
Yeah, there are some times though when if white plays incorrectly, you can oftentimes play moves like queen c6, rook h2, and if king takes, you have rook h8 with mate in h1. You know, sometimes that'll happen, but you know that's only if white plays incorrectly. I'm trying to think of how white could conceivably do that here.
Right, right.
Maybe it's in the knight a4 line. Oh, okay. I think it might be in this line, yeah. Okay, yeah, I think this is the line where white can mess up. So, you know, for example, here f3 is pretty much forced. You know, queen f3 might be tempting, but this loses. Yeah, rook h2.
Yeah, of course.
And then we lose the queen, right? Yeah, occasionally that'll happen. I mean, more often than not, you'll have crushes happen when white doesn't even play g3, or when white doesn't know what he's doing, like that Botvinnik game we saw. You know, black crashed through on the h file, right?
Right.
You know, so this was one example where we do have that sack.
Yeah.
Okay, so do y'all have any questions about the Botvinnik or earlier maybe? Now, there is kind of one other sideline that I'll mention. So after d takes c, one move you might see is white playing for a4. With a4, white's trying to recoup the pawn by not allowing you to play b5, right? But whenever white plays a4, there's always a problem with it, and that's that it weakens b4. So here we can just play bishop b4, and our bishop can settle in on that nice square. And white can still try to play aggressively here, by the way, playing e4. By the way, if white plays something like e3, black can just play b5, and already black's pretty much almost winning. You know, white doesn't have a big center, and black still has the extra pawn, right? Now, white can't take on b5 twice because knight on c3 is pinned. Right? So e4 is trickier. You know, b5 isn't so clear now because of e5. But we can play queen a5. And this is a nice move because we're threatening take on e4 and taking on c3. So for example, if white plays bishop f6, what should black do?
You should take c3.
Yeah, you take on c3 first. The point being that white has to play knight d2 because queen d2 you lose the rook, and then we take an f6. And you know, again, black is pretty much winning. You know, d4 is hanging, and if you play like bishop c4, he can take, and otherwise there's no real way to defend that, right? All right, but you know, white can play bishop d2. This exploits the fact that we can't take on c3 now because the queen's under attack, so we can't win the e4 pawn. So just one move to remember is black. You want to play c5 here. Always keep in mind, whenever you have this pawn structure in the Semi-Slav with e6 and c6, Or if you play the Caro-Kann, by the way, as black, you'll have the same pawn structure a lot of times. Your breaks are e5 and c5. In this case, we can't play e5, so c5 is necessary to break up that white center. All right. And now, for example, take bishop c4, take. Now, I guess the only downside of this line is black loses the two bishops, but we have enough lead in development that we're doing okay. For example, castle and rook d8, and black doesn't really have problems here. For example, castle, you can play b6, and after black plays bishop b7, queen e7, black won't really have any bad pieces. So even though white has the two bishops, it's pretty equal.
Maybe a space advantage.
And yeah, and white has to be careful too, because you do have these active squares tonight on d4, e5, or maybe a5. So it's not perfect for white either. When that bishop gets on b7 too, it's going to be danger.